Okay, so this talk, you might notice there's a few more names than my own added to the bottom of this, and that's because I didn't want this to be a talk where I come in and it's just kind of my ideas and that would be it, but I'd like it to be more sort of collaborative. So I had some email exchanges, I went around, asked a lot of other paleoecologists who work within the Highland region, you know, what they thought their thoughts would be in terms of future priorities, where we go with research, etc. So I thought I'd start off the talk just by going through a few environmental techniques, very briefly touching on the current picture, and I think that's going to be something more, you know, as well, it depends what you want to do with this SCAR framework, but it could be something that you develop more yourselves, or, you know, we could help you with, and then just quite a few ideas in terms of future directions. So I thought I'd first of all start off then with different environmental techniques, and I've been noting down every speaker what they've been talking about in terms of pollen. So pollen's come up quite a bit, so we'll talk about that. Charred plant remains hasn't come up that much. More, you know, I thought it'd come up a lot more, but 2 people, maybe 3 people. Human bones come up quite a lot. That's always exciting. So it'd be worth just kind of touching on some of the techniques we use. Just out of interest, how many people have taken environmental samples from sites? Okay, so how many people kind of understand what you do with that sample after you've taken it from site? Okay, so less people. How many people think it's the dark arts and don't want to get involved with it at all? I thought you might, Ian. Yeah. Okay, so we'll just explain a few different techniques then. From archaeological sites, you mainly do get sort of charred plant remains, but there's a wealth of different environmental techniques out there. And when you're working in a region as diverse as the Highlands, then you've got lots and lots of potential to do lots and lots of different and very interesting things. So I just thought I'd start off with pollen, pollen grains. As you know, all plants kind of produce pollen. They get dispersed. Some get dispersed further than others. Some are wind dispersed, some are animal dispersed. So depending on their dispersal mechanism, depends how frequently they turn up in records. But these give you the long-term sequences. So we go and take these sort of samples from things like peat bogs, of which there's many in this area, and also from lakes, and they could be locks that are current, or as we've been doing previously, or more recently rather, they could be from old drained locks. And someone was talking yesterday about the importance of doing map regression. Map regression is a really good way of finding out some of these now drained locks when they were locks, and they're really good areas to target for things like pollen and palaeopollution and things like that, which we'll talk about. So these can give really long-term records. They can go back, you know, as far as sort of 15,000 years ago. You can get stuff from interglacials as well, going back even further. So these give us the vegetational history of an area. And the catchments can vary, you know, depending on what the cover is from your sampling site. You know, if you're within a woodland, you know, your pollen catchment might only be 50 metres. You know, if you're within a big kind of raised mire area or a lock, you know, you could be up to 1 kilometre. So you can get a really good idea of, you know, quite a large area and the vegetational change within that area. And within that record as well, we can also pick up the activity of people, how they're interacting with the landscape. So it could be woodland clearance, it could be growing crops. Potentially, it could be woodland management, but you need a few different techniques for that, as well as pollen. And also it's really useful for modern ecology, so things like conservation, biodiversity, all these different things. Together with pollen, we now do non-pollen palynomorphs. So these are things like fungal spores, which you find also alongside the pollen. And these are very good for picking up things like grazing animals. So you get dung fungi, for instance. They're very good for picking up storm events, because if you get a storm event and it knocks over loads of trees, you get a lot of dead wood on the ground. You get a lot of dead wood, you get a lot of dead wood fungi on the ground as well. And also for burning events. So Glycina spora there likes really dry environments. So if you burnt the ground, get a dry environment, you see peaks in this as well. And also within non-pollen palynomorphs, you get things like testate amoebae. And these mainly sample from raised mires. So these are very good in terms of looking at how the paleohydrology has changed of an area. So very good link to climate change, you know. were the periods when it was wetter, were the periods when it was drier. So they live in different kind of conditions in terms of dry and wet. So you get different assemblage if it's really wet, you get different assemblage compared to if it's a little bit drier. And we can look at shifts in those across different areas, and that helps us build a picture then of climate change. Plant macrofossils, probably the most common thing. Perhaps not the most common. The most common is probably coming up in a second. But charred plant remains from archaeological sites. So this is where we get the information of, what crops were people growing in the past. How does that change over time? How does that change between different places? So even within the Neolithic, in one area of Inverness-shire, they might be growing this, which is naked barley. Gordon asked for this one specifically to be put in there. And also, somewhere else they might be growing emmer wheat. So we can see, different trends in terms of what people are selecting to grow. It's decision pathways that we're looking at in this kind of thing. But also, as well as grain, you get things like charred hazelnuts, you get things like charred fruit stones, so we can also see, particularly when we're looking at, the Neolithic, for example, the collection of wild foodstuffs and how important that is to their economy as well, and how that changes in the Bronze Age, for example, where you get less collection of wild foodstuffs and more intensive agriculture, more intensive cereal growing. And you can also look at it in terms of trade. And on some sites, particularly, someone mentioned urban sites and particularly Viking Age sites, you're more likely to get waterlogged deposits, things like wells, etc., things like drains, and you might get waterlogged plant remains, and that's really useful as well in terms of looking at material that otherwise may not survive without being charred. And within waterlogged plant remains, again, you can get things like sphagnum mosses. So people would go out and sample, again, raised mires. So raised mires are really important because they're fed by rainfall. So it gives you the rainfall signature. That's where they get all their water from, and helps the bog grow into the nice mound. And sphagnum is really important, again, in looking to see those shifts in wetter to drier areas as well. So things like testates, things like sphagnum, really important in helping determine that paleoclimate signal. And charcoal. Charcoal is probably the most ubiquitous find from archaeological sites, but very little is done with charcoal, and there's loads more that can be done, and hopefully by the end of this talk you'll all be loving charcoal, and you'll all go away feeling enthused about charcoal and all the many things it can tell you. But here's just an example of one sample from one site. Bags of charcoal, absolutely masses of it. But you can guarantee that if you look at most archaeological reports, charcoal analysis is very slim. There might be a few fragments identified. You'll probably get an idea of tree species. You'll probably get a weight. But most of the time, it's still used for dating. The most thing people say is, "Oh, I've got some charcoal. Can you identify it for me because I want to radiocarbon date it?" And that's pretty much where it begins and ends. But you can do a lot more, and there's a lot more stuff that's done across Europe with charcoal than we do in the UK. Ring curvature is a really important thing. If you can look at the ring curvature of your charcoal, you can identify it to branch wood, trunk wood, etc. And all of a sudden you start building a picture of how people are using trees. What kind of trees are they using? Can we look at woodland management as well as part of that? And as well as macroscopic charcoal, we have microscopic charcoal. So within our pollen, we heard about microscopic charcoal yesterday, we get lots of microscopic charcoal within our pollen. This helps tell us about, if we've got evidence of burning events, so how people are manipulating a landscape. It could be Mesolithic wetland burning, so we might get lots of grass charcoal being burnt. That's not all wood. Or it could be people burning down trees, or actually burning down already fallen trees. Or it could be people burning hill forts, all these different things. But charcoal itself, we can look at it in terms of abundance, and we can look at it in terms of size. So the larger the size, the closer you are to the actual fire event. But potentially we can also identify what things are being burnt. So sometimes charcoal retains structure, and this allows us to identify it as either grasses, rushes, or wood from looking at the anatomy. So you can see there two very different bits of charcoal. One is part of a scalariform plate, so it would be an oval shape with these bars going through it. And we can count the number of bars, and that kind of gives us an indication of what kind of tree it is. So that's either going to be birch or alder. And the other one looks like a bran flake, and that's coniferous wood. So we know it's coniferous wood because coniferous wood looks very different to deciduous wood. But within there, you can see it's got little squares, and within the little squares, it's got little pits. And there's 2 or 3 pits in those squares, and that tells us that that's more likely to be fir. And this is from a Mesolithic site in Orkney, so this is people burning driftwood. So it's quite important to be able to recognise that. Something that's not been mentioned either this weekend are insects, and we'll see probably why in a minute. But insects are really important, particularly if you're looking at urban settlements, Viking settlements, etc. The stuff that's been done in Dublin is amazing in terms of insects. Also York, very important. Tells us a lot about how people lived in the past. Tells us a lot about cleanliness. Tells us a lot about disease. But also really good for environmental reconstruction. Lots of insects are related to different tree types, different vegetation. It tells us a lot about the local ground conditions, but they also tell us about temperature change as well. So they're very sensitive to climate change. They won't stay in one place. If it gets too cold for them, they'll go. And that's really interesting. One of our undergraduates has recently done some beetle remains from a site that Caroline and myself have been working on, an intertidal site, and they've done a little palaeoclimate model as part of their work. And the average summer temperature they get for Orkney is 21 degrees. So a little bit different than today. So it's really important to kind of think about that as well in terms of the conditions that people were living in the past, not just in their houses and in structures, but also the kind of temperatures and the environmental conditions helps us to see that places actually were quite attractive places to live. It's not so very new, but there's more studies being done now on midges. So although we kind of think of them as quite nasty things and we don't like them and they get in your way when you're taking pollen cores, but they're also again a very good indicator for climate. They're very good indicators for water temperature as well, salinity. So Caroline, yesterday we were talking about sea lochs and how we can see the changes in salinity and in temperature and relate that back to sea level change. Again, midges are a good indicator of that. We can do that in comparison with diatoms and with foraminifera. So there's a whole range of different techniques that we can use to reconstruct these things. And then I didn't realise I was going to be talking about bones, so I put in some bone slides yesterday. So archaeozoology as well. I'm not an archaeozoologist, but I have colleagues who are. And again, very, very interesting information can come out of looking at faunal bone. We heard yesterday about isotopic evidence and about ancient DNA, mainly linked to humans, but also isotopic DNA, isotopes in cattle, etc., in teeth can help show us where they've been grazing, and in their bones as well, things like strontium. So that's very important when we think about sites like the Nessa Brodgar, where that cattle has come from, how it's been transported up from different areas in the UK, and we can get that information out. But also, how do people eat, butchery, wild resources, cultural identity, we are what we eat, trade and exchange, conservation. Again, a lot of the things that we use to look at past materials can also be put forward to look at present things. So, we're starting to see an increase now in lots more sort of native sheep, etc., coming back, after the Second World War. So there's more choice, more variety. People want that choice. Again, when you're kind of organic farming and for health benefits, but we can get a lot of information to see how animals have changed from the past to today. Fish as well, very important. So there's not that many fish bone people out there. So if you're thinking of future careers, that might be a good one. And again, the kind of fish horizon that's been coming up in terms of when people were eating lots of fish in the Mesolithic and then kind of plateaus. But again, I think someone mentioned Scarborough yesterday. There's more fish coming out of Scarborough to show deep sea fishing was going on in the Neolithic. And then human bone, of course. Lots of information from human bone. Already spoken about DNA, isotope studies. But again, that kind of movement, mobility, different relationships, burial rites, health, disease, all these different things from human bone. So that's just a snapshot, really, of lots of environmental techniques. But there's things that we haven't talked about. Dendrochronology, it's huge potential for dendrochronology here, particularly pine. So there was really good work done in the 70s, looking at pine stumps in peat bogs across the Highlands. Not much has been done since Hilary Burke's paper on that. But there's loads of potential there for those pine stumps to be used to build a dendrochronology record. And then take that forward and again look at things like climate change and the cause for the pine decline as well in the Bronze Age. But the important thing to take away from all these different techniques is what is the research question? So if you're looking at things like vegetational change and long-term records for that and what people are doing in the landscape, then you've got a load of techniques you can use. Pollen, non-pollen animals, plant macrofossils, insects, microscopic charcoal. Agricultural activity, again, pollen, child plant remains, animal bone, human bone. Woodland management, waterlogged wood, charcoal, pollen. Animal grazing, pollen, MPPs, insects, animal bone, palaeoclimate, loads of different things. But the important thing to take away is that these are multi-proxy studies. So we don't just do one in isolation and then that solves our problem. We have to do multiple different techniques to get a bigger picture, and that helps us get proper results. So moving on to the Highlands, I'm just going to very briefly really do this. I didn't want to go site specific on things because I kind of thought that's what people would do before me when they talked about their sites through the different periods. But this is a map that Richard Tipping produced in his 94 paper, and this is pretty much based on things like Bennett in 89 and Burke's maps, etc. Looking at what would be, this would be the woodland around about just before the Neolithic. So this would be what would be the maximum succession for woodland in Scotland, and this shows you the different kind of tree types that would have covered these areas. Now, this isn't to say that all of those areas were completely covered in trees and there weren't any gaps, but this is based on pollen data. So at a certain point in your pollen record, you find the maximum tree pollen, and you use that to build a picture across this area to kind of work out what the main tree types were. And there hasn't really been done much since Richard's paper in 94. It's a very good paper. It kind of goes into a lot of detail. He's collated lots of data in terms of looking at the locations of different pollen sites, and really it's a very good starting point for this if this is the kind of thing you want to do in terms of looking to see what's been done in the region. So this is in 94. This was all the pollen sites in Scotland. There's the Highland region that we'll be looking at. There's the pollen sites from the Highland region, so that's pretty well covered really in terms of the vegetational history. However, one thing Richard did point out is that if we look at it in terms of secure radiocarbon dates, a lot of the work was done before radiocarbon dating was very accessible, and most people kind of dated their vegetational horizons based on, if you're at the woodland stage, like the boreal, the pre-boreal, etc., the Atlantic period, and those are the kind of vegetational zones. And I think because of that, a lot of these papers aren't really looked at now in terms of comparing it back to your archaeological site because it hasn't got the dates that you're looking for. And you have to kind of work it out a bit in terms of where you are. But these are the sites that have got good radiocarbon dates, so they've got more than one radiocarbon dates. Since 94, there's obviously been a lot more pollen studies. So these are a few that I was tracking down the other day. The ones in blue are actually palaeoclimate studies, so there has been palaeoclimate work in the Highlands as well. And you can see there's quite a few new pollen studies, but there's also big areas where there aren't any pollen studies. So maybe these are areas that could be targeted, but it depends on your research question. Just a quick one on plant macrofossil studies. So CPR is charred plant remains, so these are mainly archaeological sites. And WPR is waterlogged plant remains, so these are mainly plant macrofossils that have been done to back up pollen data. So our pollen gives us a really nice picture of a landscape quite in general, but in order to see what's actually growing on the ground and also to help us get the species information for things like our trees, we do the plant macrofossils, the seeds, the buds, etc. And so these are studies that back up pollen, but also some of them are, again, Palaeoclimate in terms of sphagnum studies as well. So you can see there's a good spread of those. It's quite interesting that the pollen seems to be fairly west and the macrofossils seem to be fairly east, and that's because these are the archaeological sites, so where we're doing pollen, where we're doing the archaeology may not always match up. Poor old insects. There's only been one insect study, and that was from a monastery site. And this is a map from 2010, so it's pretty recent in terms of insect remains. So you can see there's a lot of potential in terms of work that could be done in the Highlands for either child plant remains, etc. And one of the things that might come out of this is if you wanted to do a map such as this, you could then have a key that's Neolithic sites, Bronze Age sites, etc. it's really difficult to get all this information and put it on this map. It's very time consuming. There's no button on CanMore that you can press to say, here's all the child plant remain studies, here's all the pollen studies. So you have to go through the literature, you have to go through people's research papers, you have to go through journal papers, and you have to work out, is it analysis, is it just assessment? If it's just assessment, it's not going to give you all the information you want in terms of quantity and really describing the remains in detail. And even if it is analysis, did they analyse all the samples, just a selection of samples, how much more is there to do? And you can bet there's probably lots more material in the archives, etc., from samples that were taken that have never really been looked at in terms of fulfilling their potential, the poor old samples. So I just thought I'd go for some future directions now in terms of, what can we do that's new and fresh? If you want to do an overview of all that's gone before, I think that's already been captured in the SCARF 2012 document, to be honest. If you go through all the panels, you'll find, the main key sites for child plant remains, the main key sites for charcoal, which will be very few because there's not much charcoal studies that have been done, the main key sites for pollen, etc. So, you could try and reinvent the wheel and do that again, or you could just leave it and then think about new and fresh things that you could do as part of a research agenda for the Highlands itself. So put here targeted areas for pollen. There's obviously some good blank spots within there where you could go and do more pollen studies. But I guess it should be, you should go where the research question takes you. So if you've got a good research question, you'll find sites on the back of your research question that would fit that. And I'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. Or if you just want to go and target an area and do a pollen study in an area, that's fine. You'll get new information. But really, I think it all should be linked into a wider theme. And I think cross-cutting themes and thematic approach is the way to go for these kind of things. New innovations in pollen. So we talk about NPPs, new things. It's really good. If you go back to pollen diagrams from the 80s downwards, even some of the 90s, you won't get much in the way of fungal spores. So you won't get much chat about animal grazing, storm damage, etc. But one thing that's been going on now is pollen modelling. So this is mapping the vegetation cover of an area based on your pollen results. And essentially what this does is it looks at modern pollen rain. So it looks to see, if you're X distance from a woodland, what would your pollen signature be compared to if you were in that woodland? And you can use that to kind of then map out an area to give a general model of how much woodland cover you would have in an area, how much is open, how much is heathland, how much is agriculture, all these different things. This is one study that's been done in the Highlands, so there's only one pollen modelling study that's been done in the Highlands. That's quite a new and interesting thing, and it'd be interesting to compare this to different areas. Of course, with models, all models are wrong, but they give you something to compare to and something to test against. Yeah. So we're not saying this is exactly where trees are, but we're just showing you this is, approximately the woodland cover that would be in that area and how that changes over time. It could be the same for agriculture. Althea Davis has done a lot of work on this, Palaeoecology and Conservation. So as well as thinking about archaeology and how we can use vegetation records to show people interacting with an environment, we can also look at it in terms of modern ecology. And it's really important in the Highlands because we've got the flow country. And in the flow country, they're reinstating a lot of peat bogs, and they're also looking to reinstate areas of the native woodland in different places, such as sort of riverine areas. So one of my other PhD students, Jasmine, has been doing a project looking at this. She's got 3 sites in the Highlands. She's looking to see what the native woodland was. Is it feasible to replant it in the areas where the Forestry Commission want to replant it in those areas? But also it gives us a really good biodiversity record, and biodiversity is something that we should be looking at as well. And that doesn't just come from pollen, but also from insects, and also from things like child plant remains. And 2 talks ago, someone was mentioning cereal drying kilns. Cereal drying kilns are an absolutely brilliant resource for archaeobotanists. One, they're normally full of cereal grain. If there is molting evidence in there, we will find that because you'll find lots of embryo fragments and you'll find grown grains. But also, it's the weed seeds, and those weed seeds are really important. They tell us lots about how crops were grown, field conditions, what the local vegetation is like around those areas, but also helps us trace back weed seeds. When did they first appear? Things like corn marigold, etc. And that also helps us then give a proxy dating record for things too. So modern conservation is a really good link, and kind of takes us right up to the present day. Something I'm really interested in, working with colleagues like Tim Moyle at Aberdeen University is Palaeopollution Records. So here's Culduthel again, which I had the privilege, sort of a pleasure-privilege combo there, of looking at the charred plant remains from this site. But it has loads of furnaces, loads of smelting evidence, loads of metalworking. This must have had a massive impact on the landscape. There has to be a chemical signature for this. And we can look at that to kind of see what impact this did have on the landscape. Would that have also impacted people's health, living in this environment and also working in these conditions? Also, you can see there from those post holes, huge trees must have been to get this kind of post holes. What impact did that have on the landscape? If you remember back to my map, there's no pollen diagrams for Inverness, not really. So we don't know what impact this would have had on that landscape. So that's a really good question. And if you tie that in with the charcoal, there is so much charcoal from this site. So again, thinking about, sustainability, woodland management, did they just chop down a load of trees and use that in terms of how they were smelting, how they were using it for construction of massive roundhouses? Or did they use it in a sustainable way? Did they just go for branch wood? What kind of tree types were they using? The charcoal from this site hasn't really been touched. So again, it's a huge question there. Palaeopollution, charcoal, pollen. It's going to be a really good story. And that should be compared with other metalworking sites as well, across Scotland. This is a big Iron Age roundhouse site. What does metalworking look like at Brock sites, for example? Is it comparable? Plant macrofossils as well. So charred plant remains. So there's been a few studies of charred plant remains, kind of, Scotland focused when we think of like Rosie Bishop's work in the Neolithic, and you can look at that in the PSAS volume in 2009. She looks at, what people were growing around the time in the Neolithic. They've now done one similar for the Mesolithic. There's nothing really for the Bronze Age or the Iron Age on that. And particularly the early medieval period, if we think of like Pictish archaeology, as we heard yesterday, lots of power centres, lots of Pictish standing stones, lots of churches, agriculture. We don't really understand. Yet, at the same time as that's going on, people are returning to growing flax again. There's different crops coming in as well. Hull barley, oats takes off big time, considering from the Iron Age. So there's definitely things going on, and people are selecting different crops, doing different things. So that would be a really interesting thing to look at as well, comparing that across different sites. Post-medieval agriculture, again, another important thing that's not really looked at. We have been doing some work on the Shieling project and looking at samples from the Shieling project as well. That would be a good thing to compare that. The effect of the Little Ice Age on agriculture as well in the Highlands, that would be an interesting one to look at. The emergence of bear barley, we kind of think of that as mainly, I suppose, Northern Isles, but it wasn't. It was down here as well. So when did that first appear? There's so many things that we could do with charred plant macrofossils as well. So loads of potential there. Caroline mentioned this yesterday. Intertidal peats and submerged forests. Where are you going to sort of have your line in terms of, are you just going to look at stuff on land? Are you going to go into the intertidal zone? Are you going to go out again into the maritime zone? There's loads of potential here in the Highlands for this sort of thing. This is just an example from the Western Isles of intertidal woodland, so submerged forest remains. Michael Sharp, who was here yesterday, took the photo on my right, your left, of Berg Head and intertidal peats there. So these deposits do exist all around, but they're not being looked at. And again, when you think about these wood remains of trees that are in there, this is the actual woodland. This is the 5,000-year-old woodland. So we can look at this in pollen, but if we get out into these areas, we can actually look at the trees themselves. And that's really useful, because in pollen, for example, in the Western Isles, most of that woodland is willow, and there's a bit of birch. But in the pollen, it will show that it's mainly all birch and there's hardly any willow. So we need kind of both sets of data to understand woodland character. And this is the woodland people were living in. It's the woodland that animals were living in. Foraging, hunting, woodland resource, all this different thing. It's all in there. So these kind of deposits are really, really important. Just put this in because someone mentioned yesterday that it's hard to get schools involved in work. This is a load of school kids standing on tree trunks in the submerged forest. This is them being trees for one of our drone shots. But also it gives us an idea of, density of woodland. Pockets of those woodland exists. And we find this all the time, that these pockets of peat are often barried either side by bedrock and stone. You also find stuff in peat as well. So this is a tree trunk that we found in Orkney, and half an oak tree trunk. But this is the sort of material that might be within the intertidal zone. It might be natural organic things like this, although this is oak and it shouldn't be there, so someone's obviously put that there. But it could be things like fish traps, which we alluded to yesterday. In the Western Isles, there's also structures and saddle querns and things. So that obviously shows you this landscape has changed immensely from when these people were living there. But so there's potential there as well to go and have a look in these areas and see what can come out. Which brings you on to mobility and transport. Organic material, organic remains within these sort of environments, estuarine environments, riverine environments, tidal peat environments. You might find things like maritime craft, and mobility would be a really good theme to look at. We don't know a lot about Mesolithic, Neolithic boats, but they were using them. So we've got things like the Tay here in terms of Bronze Age material, but we don't, we don't know enough about other things. So again, one of the things I would say about the scarf thing is that don't just look at the Highland region. Look at these themes that cross different regional frameworks. The last thing we want is to kind of be stuck in the kind of getting a project together that we can only do in the Highland region, and we can't take it out broader. These are themes that cross-cut all of the frameworks, and they're in the national framework. So maybe it dispersed through. Charcoal. I just wanted to say stuff about charcoal because I find charcoal is amazing. These are cremation pyres. So this is cremation material. This is from Wales. There isn't really, I can't think of any studies that have done this in Scotland, even in the Highland region. So you can see here, charcoal assemblages from pyres are really useful because they tell us about the material that someone's specifically chosen, the tree they've specifically chosen to go and make that funeral pyre, and that tells us a bit about cultural values of material as well. And always within these kind of funeral pyres, here, Wales, etc., you find they're kind of dominated often by one tree type, and there's always a kind of small bit of branchwood of something else. So it could be hazel, it could be fruitwood. Again, this is the same site, but you can see different tree types now. One's just completely Meloideae, which is fruitwood. We can't tell hawthorn, pear, and apple apart from their wood anatomy from the charcoal, so it's one of those three. And then there's ones that are just oak with a bit of Meloideae, and one again that's just all alder. So is this people just using local resources, or are they going to special places, sacred woodland groves, etc.? And we can then interpolate this. This helps us provide a narrative for our archaeology on the site. So here, those really small bits of wood that you always get, could they represent flowering branches that have been put on the pyre? Could they represent objects, spears, arrows, etc., that have been put on there as well? But also, if you look at the literature, there's loads of material about, cultural values of trees. There's the world tree there, ash. Healing properties of trees is a really big thing now in terms of green exercise as well. Getting out into the woodlands, good for mental health. All these different things. There's actual literal benefit as well, like aspirin from willow bark. Medicinal values of plants, all these different things. So charcoal can tell a story about all of this. It can also help with woodland management. So again, this is from a burnt mound site. Of which there's plenty of burnt mound sites, as we saw yesterday on that map. So there's potential to do this here as well. And again, this is just breaking down different burnt mounds into their woodland assemblages, but most of it is small size, medium sized timber. In the pollen records at this site, we don't get a massive decrease in woodland when all these burnt mounds are in use. So it suggests that people were managing the trees themselves to keep that resource going. Palaeoclimate. There's only a couple of palaeoclimate studies here in the Highlands, but there's loads of potential, particularly, you've got flow country, etc., loads of sphagnum, loads of testate potential. So you could do more work like Dan Charman's work here in terms of looking at climatic variability and link that back to archaeology. How does that relate to some of the big changes we see socially in archaeology? How does it relate back to people? Caroline spoke yesterday about sea level change and about living in an environment with sea level change. They didn't know the sea level was going to stop. They didn't know it was going to reduce. So adaptability and resilience. People living in these conditions, big topics. And then faunal bone, medieval middens. When we think about faunal bone, we often think about prehistory, looking at first animals that people were eating, people were using. But medieval middens, very understudied. Lots of evidence there for different agricultural practices, and particularly, again, going back to the coastal theme, our coastal stuff's under risk. These are really good areas to target. If you're talking to Joe or Tom, they'll be here saying, these are the areas we've got to go and look at. So these are a resource that we're losing. So the less we do on these, the more likely it is we're going to lose lots of information about these things. And again, fish bone, Mesolithic fauna, we know very little about Mesolithic fauna. Late Neolithic, early Bronze Age tradition, what's happening there in terms of the livestock, in terms of the cereals, etc., in terms of farming methods as a whole. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of highlight, which I think is really important, is training and legacy. So someone mentioned yesterday about having a legacy for SCARF. Well, I think a really good legacy for SCARF, and not just this framework, but every framework, would be training of people in different specialisms. Insects, there's Alanis in a pit where we dug our insect samples from. There's maybe one insect person in Scotland working at Edinburgh University. There's very few. Pollen, there's not that many of us. Lots of us people retiring. There's definitely a generation gap in terms of that, so having Jasmine being trained for that is really important. But Testates, Foraminifera, Ostracods, all these different things that we can get really good information from. Charcoal, wood IDs, charred plant remains, lots of material that I imagine as well would be readily available from things like Cool Duffel. Loads of charcoal from that. Nothing's been happening with it. It's just sitting there. There must be more material in archives that are sitting there that could be really good for someone to be learning a skill, being trained up, but also to provide some really, really important information, not just for this region, but different regions, in terms of, human interaction with woodland, diet, loads of different potential there. So I think it's really important that, someone mentioned PhDs. PhDs would be a really good one. MReses would be a really good one. That would be a really nice thing to say that we've done this project for 3 years, we've got our book, we've got our research questions, whatever, but also, here we go, we trained a person up, they're living proof that this existed. And then lastly, just a bit of fun, this screen always reminds me of Catchphrase, with the 6 do-do-do. So, name the pollen. Anybody know? No?
Is it the one with the Mickey Mouse ear?
It is, yeah. That's pine. Pine pollen with big air sacs. Any more? Triangular one? No. That's hazel. Yeah, looks like a teddy bear's head. Mickey Mouse and a teddy bear. That's what pollen. That's how we describe pollen. That's why we need kids being trained up.
Excellent bit of skills development there at the end. Thank you very much.